Southwest Montana does not reward optimism. It never has. At 6,000 feet, winter is not a season. It is a force that tests every weak decision you made months earlier. In the high country, snow does not fall gently. It arrives heavy, wet, and driven sideways by wind that never seems to rest. Temperatures can drop 40 degrees in a single night. What looks like a normal winter in October can turn deadly by January. This is not bad luck. It is geography. In the late 1800s, settlers kept repeating the same mistake. They built for the average winter. Straight walls, shallow foundations, light logs, just enough firewood to feel responsible, but not enough to survive a year that went wrong. Most of them knew winter could be harsh. Few of them planned for winter at its worst. The frontier punished that gap between knowing and preparing. Cabins failed quietly at first. A draft here, a warped door there. Then the real damage began. Walls bowed under snowdrifts. Roofs sagged under weight they were never designed to carry. Chinking fell out as logs dried and shrank in deep cold. Heat leaked away faster than any stove could replace it. Families burned wood faster, slept closer together, and waited for spring as if waiting alone could save them. The hard truth is, this winter does not care how hard you worked. It only cares whether your structure can handle load, cold, and time. In the high country, snow becomes weight. Wind becomes pressure. Cold becomes hunger. A cabin is not shelter because it looks solid. It is shelter only if it keeps standing when everything else fails. Frontier survival was never about toughness. It was about design, about understanding forces you could not see but would eventually feel, about building something that improved under stress instead of breaking from it. Every generation learns this lesson the hard way. Some men learned it early by watching mountains, earth, and old structures that had already passed the test. Others learned it too late. The land always decides who was right. The man who built differently did not arrive in the valley by accident. He was shaped by places where mistakes had consequences. Before he ever claimed land, he worked rail lines through mountain country. Long days, cold camps, frozen ground that fought every shovel strike. He watched engineers do something that confused most laborers. They leaned walls into hillsides instead of standing them straight. When asked why, the answer was simple: mountains push back. Straight walls crack. Angled walls carry weight. Later he traveled farther north and west, places where winter was not treated as a surprise. He saw homes dug partly into the earth, roof lines low and steep, walls sloped, snow piled deliberately against buildings not cleared away. Inside those structures, people lived calmly while storms raged outside. Fires burned slow, wood piles lasted. Those builders were not guessing. They were responding to winters that killed careless men. By the time he reached Montana, he carried something most settlers lacked. Not money, not strength, perspective. He understood that cold is predictable, but storms are not. He understood that nature does not give warnings that matter. And he understood one rule that frontier life kept proving over and over again. You do not build for how winter usually behaves. You build for the one winter that tries to break you. To his neighbors, he looked cautious. Too cautious. He took longer, used more material, asked questions no one else bothered to ask. How much snow can pile against a wall? Where does that force go? What happens after weeks of freezing and thawing? They believed experience meant repeating what worked last year. He believed experience meant learning from places where failure was common. That difference mattered. Most settlers saw cabins as temporary, something to get through a season or two. He saw a cabin as a system: walls, ground, snow, heat, all working together or all working against you. He was not trying to outbuild his neighbors. He was trying to outlast the winter they had not yet imagined. Most frontier cabins failed for the same reason: they were built fast, not smart. Settlers followed habits they already knew. Straight walls were familiar. Vertical logs looked solid and respectable. A shallow stone foundation saved time and labor. Everything was done with the idea that winter was something to endure, not something that would actively attack the structure itself. But snow is not passive. When it piles up, it becomes weight. When wind packs it tight against a wall, it becomes pressure. A vertical wall takes that pressure straight across its weakest direction. Logs begin to bow. Joints open. Chinking falls out. Once air starts moving through a cabin, heat loss accelerates fast. Roof failure followed the same pattern. Many cabins used low or moderate roof pitches. Snow did not slide off. It stacked. Each storm added another layer. Wet snow froze into solid mass. Rafters designed for normal loads began to flex. Flexing turned into cracking. Cracking turned into collapse. Foundations were another weak point. Shallow stone piers worked fine in mild years, but deep frost changed everything. Ground heaved, stones shifted. A wall that had been square in October was no longer square by January. Small movements multiplied stress everywhere else. Firewood shortages made things worse. As cabins leaked heat, families burned more wood just to keep from freezing. Wood piles vanished. Green wood smoked. Stoves worked harder while delivering less heat. None of these failures happened suddenly. They happened quietly night after night, storm after storm. By the time a cabin showed visible damage, the real failure had already occurred in the planning stage. Frontier builders were not foolish. They were rushed. Land claims livestock and short seasons pushed speed over margin. But winter does not respect schedules. A cabin that survives the average year is not a safe cabin. A safe cabin survives the year no one planned for. That truth separated structures that failed from those that quietly endured. Long before frontier cabins dotted the valleys of the American West, builders already knew how to deal with heavy pressure. They just stopped paying attention. Across Europe, stone fortifications were rarely built straight. Castle walls leaned inward. Retaining walls along mountain roads were angled. The reason was simple and practical. When force hits a vertical wall, it tries to push it over. When force hits a slanted wall, much of that pressure is redirected downward into the ground. That design is called a battered wall. It is not decorative, it is defensive. Railroad engineers used it constantly. Stone abutments and cuts through hillsides were built with angled faces because mountains move. Gravity never rests. Straight walls crack. Angled walls compress. Compression is something stone, earth, and heavy timber can handle very well. Indigenous builders understood this too. Earth lodges, pit houses, and semi-subterranean homes all relied on sloped walls and earth cover. Snow and soil pressed inward and downward, tightening the structure instead of tearing it apart. These homes stayed warm with minimal fuel because heat had nowhere easy to escape. On the frontier, much of that knowledge was ignored. Settlers brought building habits from milder climates where snow loads were lighter and winters shorter. Vertical walls became the standard, not because they were better, but because they looked right and went up faster. The problem was not ignorance, it was misplaced confidence. A battered wall looks wrong to someone trained to expect straight lines. It looks unfinished, weak, like a mistake. But under load, it behaves the opposite way. Snow presses in, the wall pushes down, the foundation carries the weight. The structure settles tighter instead of pulling apart. This is not theory, it is basic force behavior. The frontier punished builders who fought gravity instead of guiding it. The men who paid attention to old walls, old roads, and old shelters were not trying to be clever. They were copying solutions that had already survived centuries of hard winters. The idea was never lost. It was simply ignored until winter reminded everyone why it existed. Cold air is unstable, the ground is not. One of the most overlooked survival advantages on the frontier was Earth itself. Below the frost line, soil holds a steady temperature year-round. In mountain country, that temperature often stays in the low to mid-50s even when the air above drops far below zero. Most settlers built their cabins fully above ground. It felt cleaner, easier, less work. But it ignored a simple fact: air steals heat fast and Earth does not. By cutting a cabin partially into a south-facing hillside, a builder gained several advantages at once. Wind exposure dropped. One or two walls were shielded from direct weather. Heat loss slowed. The cabin stopped fighting the environment and started using it. Earth-sheltered walls do not freeze the way exposed walls do. They stay closer to their natural temperature. That means less heat escaping through the structure and less fuel required to replace it. In deep winter, this difference can decide whether a wood pile lasts or disappears before spring. Digging also stabilized foundations. Frost heave was less severe where soil temperature stayed consistent. Stones settled instead of shifting. Weight transferred directly into solid ground rather than unstable surface layers. To many settlers, digging deeper looked like wasted effort. They saw no immediate benefit in September. But winter does not reward effort you can see right away. It rewards effort that pays off when conditions turn hostile. The hillside was not an obstacle. It was insulation structure and thermal storage all in one. Builders who understood this stopped thinking of cabins as boxes placed on land. They treated them as extensions of the terrain itself. Walls leaned into slopes, foundations locked into earth. Snow piled harmlessly against protected sides. The result was not just warmth, it was predictability. Temperatures changed slowly, fires burned evenly. Nights were survivable without constant tending. On the frontier, stability was safety, and nothing offered stability like building into the ground that had already survived thousands of winters. On the frontier, speed was mistaken for skill. Men rushed to finish cabins before the first hard freeze. Every extra day spent building felt like a risk. Snow could come early, tools could break, hands could fail, so cabins went up fast, straight, and light. If something went wrong later, they believed they would fix it when spring arrived. That belief cost people their comfort and sometimes their lives. The man who built slower stood out immediately. While others were stacking walls by mid-September, he was still shaping stone. While neighbors cut small logs to save time, he dragged in heavier timber. While cabins around him were already roofed, he was still checking angles and pinning joints. To the valley it looked wasteful, unnecessary, even arrogant. But he was not racing winter. He was negotiating with it. Every choice slowed the build but increased margin. Thicker walls, deeper foundation, a deliberate inward lean that required careful layout on every log course. Each decision added hours now so they would not steal weeks later. Frontier culture valued visible progress. A standing cabin looked like success. A half-finished structure looked like failure. But winter does not grade effort by appearances. Slower construction allowed corrections. Logs were fitted instead of forced. Stone was seated instead of stacked. Angles were checked instead of guessed. Nothing relied on hope. Neighbors laughed because they assumed all cabins failed the same way. They believed survival was mostly about endurance. Keep feeding the stove, keep working, keep pushing through. He believed survival was about avoiding problems before they started. That difference mattered when storms arrived back to back, when wood ran low, and when fixing mistakes in frozen darkness became dangerous. Speed builds shelter. Margin builds safety. On the frontier, the man willing to look inefficient in September often slept calmly in January. Most cabins relied on weight alone to stay together. Logs stacked, corners notched, gravity did the rest. That worked until forces came from the side. This cabin was built to act as one piece. The logs were larger than most settlers used. Not because bigger logs looked better, but because mass resists movement. A heavy wall takes longer to bend. It takes more force to shift. That matters when snow drifts press day after day without letting up. Each log course was fitted carefully, not rushed. The inward lean had to stay consistent. If one course drifted out of alignment, the whole wall would fight itself under load. Precision here was not craftsmanship for pride. It was structural insurance. Then came the pins. Hardwood pegs were driven through intersecting logs at regular intervals, not just at the corners, along the walls, through critical joints. These pegs locked the wall together so it could not roll, twist, or separate when pressure increased. To most builders, pegs were optional, a nice extra if time allowed. Nails were faster, or nothing at all. But nails shear, and loose joints open under stress. The pegs turned the wall into a single compressed shell. When snow pressed against the outside, the load traveled through every log at once instead of concentrating on weak spots. The wall did not flex independently. It worked as a unit. This is the principle of compression. Materials like woodstone and earth handle downward force far better than bending or pulling. By angling the walls and pinning the logs, pressure that would normally cause failure was redirected into something the structure could survive. The heavier the load became, the tighter everything fit. This is why the cabin did not loosen with time. It improved. Gaps closed instead of opening. Joints seated deeper. The building aged forward, not backward. Most frontier cabins grew weaker as winter progressed. This one grew stronger. That was not luck, it was force management. On the frontier, understanding how materials fail is more important than knowing how fast to build. Most settlers treated snow like an enemy to be fought every day. They shoveled it away from walls. They hacked it off roofs. They burned energy and firewood trying to keep their cabins exposed. That instinct made sense until it worked against them. Snow is not just cold. When packed and left undisturbed, it becomes insulation. Trapped air inside, settled snow slows heat loss the same way wool or straw does. The problem is not snow itself. The problem is letting snow push on weak structures. This cabin was built to let snow stay. As winter deepened, snow naturally drifted against the slanted walls. Instead of shoveling it away, the builder added to it. He pulled snow in with a shovel and packed it carefully along the lower courses of the walls, 3 feet deep, dense, even. To outsiders, it looked reckless, like burying the cabin alive. But physics told a different story. The snowbank blocked wind, the fastest thief of heat. It created a thermal blanket that reduced temperature swings inside the cabin. Cold nights became less severe. Warm days didn't cause rapid thawing and refreezing. Everything slowed down. That mattered. Rapid temperature changes cause materials to move enough and joints fail. By buffering the structure with snow, the cabin experienced fewer extremes. Less stress, less damage. This method wasn't new. Arctic shelters, earth lodges, and winter camps had used the same idea for generations. Snow used correctly was part of the structure, not a threat to it. The slanted walls made it safe. Snow pressure turned downward into the foundation instead of inward into the logs. What would have crushed a straight wall simply settled and stayed. The result was a quieter cabin. No howling drafts, no constant stove feeding, no panic when storms stacked up faster than expected. On the frontier, survival wasn't about clearing nature away. It was about letting nature do work for you without letting it do damage. Snow didn't have to be defeated. It had to be understood. By early December, it was clear this was not a normal year. Snow stopped melting between storms. What fell stayed. Each new system added weight instead of replacing it. Drifts hardened, trails disappeared. The valley grew quiet in the way that only comes when movement becomes dangerous. Temperatures dropped hard and fast. Nights went well below zero. Days barely climbed out of it. Wind swept across open ground and packed snow against every structure in its path. What had looked manageable in November began to feel heavy by Christmas. This was the kind of winter old trappers warned about. The one that didn't announce itself as exceptional until it was already too late to adjust. Cabins that had seemed fine a month earlier began to show signs of strain. Doors stuck as frames shifted. Frost formed on interior walls. Chinking cracked and fell out in small pieces at first, then in strips. The sound of wind inside homes became constant. Wood piles shrank fast. Men who had planned carefully for an average winter found themselves cutting into reserves meant for spring. Green wood went into stoves because there was no other choice. Smoke-filled cabins, heat output dropped. Families burned more fuel and stayed colder at the same time. Livestock suffered first. Cattle drifted into draws for shelter and froze where they stood when storms closed in faster than expected. Horses broke through crusted snow and injured themselves. Feed became unreachable under hard-packed drifts. The valley was being tested as a system, not as individuals. Every weakness lined up at once. Structures leaked heat. Fuel supplies ran low. Repairs became harder as tools froze and daylight shortened. Small problems combined into large ones. This is how frontier disasters happened. Not through one dramatic event, but through pressure that never let up. Some winters pass, others expose every shortcut you ever took. By the turn of the year, it was clear which cabins had been built to endure stress and which had only been built to stand still. Structures rarely fail all at once, they warn you first. In the middle of the winter, straight-walled cabins began to make new sounds. A low creak during the night, a sharp crack when temperatures dropped suddenly. Timber under stress does not stay quiet. Snow drifted hard against north and west walls, packing into dense, icy banks. With nowhere for the force to go, the pressure pushed straight across the logs. Walls bowed inward by inches, sometimes more. At first it was barely noticeable, then doors no longer closed. Window frames twisted. Chinking blew out and left long seams where cold air poured in. Inside those cabins, the stove never rested. Fires burned hot but uneven. Heat pooled near the ceiling and vanished through gaps lower down. Families slept in layers. Water froze just a few feet from the stove. Every morning began with damage control. Roof problems followed. Snow that should have slid off stayed in place. It melted slightly during warm spells, then refroze into heavy slabs. Rafters designed for lighter loads began to sag. Nails loosened, notches creaked under shifting weight. The worst part was uncertainty. People did not know if their cabins would last the night. Each storm added pressure without relief. Fixes were temporary. Extra bracing helped for a while. Shoveling bought time but cost energy. Every solution required work that grew more dangerous as conditions worsened. A straight wall has no margin. When it reaches its limit, failure comes fast. Some families abandoned rooms they could no longer heat. Others slept fully dressed, listening to the building groan and hoping morning would come without collapse. Cabins were never meant to feel alive, but under stress these ones did. The frontier taught its lesson without explanation. Structures either managed force or became part of the problem. While other cabins groaned and shifted, this one stayed quiet. Inside, there were no sharp drafts, no cold seams along the floor, no frost creeping across the walls. The air felt steady, not warm in a luxurious way, but stable, predictable. That mattered more than comfort. The stove burned slow and even. It did not need constant feeding. A banked fire at night still left usable coals by morning. The heat stayed where it was produced instead of leaking out through gaps and weak joints. Temperature changes inside the cabin happened gradually. When outside air dropped hard, the interior barely noticed. When a brief warm spell passed through the cabin, did not swing wildly in response. That stability reduced stress on the structure and on the people living inside it. This was not accidental. The partially buried walls stayed close to ground temperature. The snowbanks blocked wind entirely. The slanted walls compressed under load instead of opening up. Every element worked together. Nothing fought the others. In failing cabins, people lived at the mercy of their stoves. Here, the stove was just one part of a larger system. Heat loss was slow enough that the fire didn't have to work constantly to catch up. That changed behavior. People slept better. They conserved energy. They stopped worrying about whether the building itself would betray them in the night. Quiet is underrated in survival. A calm structure allows clear thinking. It prevents panic decisions. It preserves strength for when it's actually needed. In long winters, mental stability matters as much as physical warmth. The cabin did not feel heroic. It felt boring, solid, uneventful. That was the point. On the frontier, the best shelter is the one that disappears into the background, the one that does its job without demanding attention. When winter is relentless, calm becomes a form of wealth. This cabin wasn't fighting the season. It was letting the season pass. When people finally asked how the cabin worked, the explanation was simple enough to draw on a flat piece of wood with a bit of charcoal. First, a straight wall. Draw a line. Push against it from the side. The force has only one place to go, into bending the wall. Keep pushing long enough and something gives. Then a slanted wall. Same push. This time, most of that force slides downward along the angle. Instead of bending the wall, it presses the wall into the ground. Earth and stone handle that kind of load easily. That was the whole lesson. Snow does not crush buildings from above the way people imagine. It pushes sideways when it piles up. Wind packs it tight, ice locks it in place. A vertical wall has to fight that pressure. A battered wall redirects it. The foundation matters just as much. A strong wall without a solid base only moves the problem downward. That is why the stonework was thick wide and locked into the hillside. The goal was not to resist movement, but to give force somewhere safe to go. This is how old builders worked. Not with equations, but with observation. They watched what failed. They copied what stayed standing. They simplified the problem until the answer was obvious. Modern engineering would later give names to these ideas: load paths, lateral forces, compression versus tension. But none of that was required to survive a frontier winter. You only needed to understand one thing: materials break when you ask them to do what they are bad at. Wood is bad at bending sideways under heavy load. Stone and earth are good at carrying weight straight down. The cabin was designed around that reality. That is why when snow piled higher and heavier, the structure did not weaken. It settled, tightened, improved. The storm applied pressure, and the building responded by becoming more secure. The lesson was never mysterious. It was just rarely respected. On the frontier, the men who understood force did not argue with winter. They guided it and slept through the night while others listened to their walls complain. What frustrated later observers was not that good ideas didn't exist. It was that most people refused to use them. On the frontier, being seen as capable mattered. Men copied what others did because fitting in felt safer than standing out. A straight-walled cabin looked proper. It looked finished. It matched what everyone else had built. That mattered more than whether it would survive a bad winter. There was also pride involved. Many settlers believed hardship could be overcome through effort alone. If a cabin leaked heat, they burned more wood. If snow piled up, they shoveled harder. Admitting that a different design worked better felt like admitting weakness or ignorance. That was not easy for men trying to prove themselves in a hard land. Time pressure played a role too. Land claims had deadlines. Livestock needed care. Food had to be secured. Building slower felt irresponsible when so many tasks competed for attention. Long-term thinking lost to short-term urgency. And then there was fear of being mocked. A cabin with slanted walls looked wrong. It invited comments. It invited judgment. On the frontier, ridicule carried weight. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the man who built a crooked house until it turned out that crooked was stronger. The truth is uncomfortable. Many people saw the better solution and still chose not to use it. They chose what felt normal, what felt familiar, what felt socially safe. Winter doesn't care about social comfort. When conditions turned extreme, those same men paid for choices driven by pride, habit, and fear of standing apart. Not because they were foolish, but because they were human. The frontier exposed that weakness without mercy. Survival rarely favors the man who blends in. It favors the one willing to look wrong early so he isn't broken later. That lesson outlived the cabins themselves. Before building codes, before charts and formulas, builders still had standards. They just didn't write them down. Old builders measured risk with memory. They remembered which walls cracked, which roofs sagged, which homes stayed warm when fuel ran low. Every winter was a test, and every failure left evidence. This was practical engineering. No calculations on paper, just outcomes that could not be argued with. If a structure survived 3 hard winters, it was copied. If it failed once, it was avoided. Knowledge moved through observation, not instruction manuals. That is why many old techniques look excessive by modern standards. They were built with margin because margin was cheaper than rebuilding or freezing. Overbuilding was not waste, it was insurance. A thicker wall meant fewer repairs in February. A deeper foundation meant fewer surprises in March. Slanted walls meant snow could pile up without becoming a threat. Every extra hour of labor up front saved days of emergency work later. Modern construction often aims for efficiency, just enough material, just enough strength, just enough safety. That approach works when conditions stay within expectations. The frontier did not offer that luxury. Old builders expected failure somewhere sometime, so they added margin everywhere they could afford it. They did not trust averages, they trusted extremes. They also understood something modern builders sometimes forget: materials age. Wood dries and shrinks, stone settles, joints loosen. A design that works perfectly on day one may not work at all 5 years later. That is why old structures were designed to improve under load instead of degrade. Compression tightened joints. Weight seated foundations. Time made the building stronger, not weaker. These men did not need equations to know what survived. Winter did the math for them. When later engineers finally put numbers to these principles, they confirmed what old builders already knew. Angled walls reduce lateral stress. Earth moderates temperature. Mass slows heat loss. Margin saves lives. The frontier did not reward precision, it rewarded durability. And durability came from builders who trusted experience over appearance and survival over efficiency. Spring did not arrive gently that year. It revealed damage instead. As the snow finally pulled back from the valley, cabins told their stories. Walls that never returned to square. Roof lines that sagged permanently. Foundations shifted just enough to make doors useless. Some structures were still standing, but they were no longer safe. They would survive fair weather, but not another hard winter. A few families rebuilt, others left. Firewood shortages carried over into spring. Livestock losses changed plans that had seemed secure the previous summer. The cost of winter showed up slowly in decisions that could no longer be delayed. And then there was the cabin that came through intact. When the snowbanks melted away from its slanted walls, something unexpected appeared. The structure was tighter than it had been before winter. Logs seated more firmly in their notches. Chinking held fast. The foundation had not shifted. The building looked unchanged, but it felt improved. That mattered. A house that survives winter without emergency repairs gives its owner time. Time to plant. Time to rebuild fences. Time to help neighbors. Time to think ahead instead of catching up. People noticed. Some asked questions quietly. Others pretended not to see the difference. But when rebuilding began, small changes appeared. Slightly deeper foundations. Thicker walls on the windward side. A hint of slope where there hadn't been one before. Not everyone copied the full design. Few were willing to. But the idea spread in pieces the way practical knowledge always does. The winter did not turn everyone into better builders, but it removed doubt. It proved that preparation worked. That building for the worst case was not pessimism, it was realism. Frontier winters did not teach gently, they taught clearly. And when the land finally softened, it remembered which structures had respected its power, and which ones had only hoped it would be kind. The lesson from that winter did not stay in the valley. It never does. Frontier life stripped problems down to their core. There was no backup system, no rescue coming, no room for theory that failed under pressure. What worked, stayed. What didn't, disappeared. The rule was simple: build for the worst year, not the average one. That rule applies far beyond cabins. A house built only for normal weather fails when conditions turn extreme. A savings plan built only for good years collapses when income stops. A body maintained only for comfort struggles when age adds weight and limits recovery. In every case, the mistake is the same: planning for what usually happens instead of what eventually will. Modern life hides this reality. Systems are smoother, failures are delayed, consequences feel distant, but they still arrive, just like winter. The frontier did not reward optimism, it rewarded margin, extra strength, extra preparation, extra thought before problems became emergencies. That old cabin with slanted walls was not clever, it was honest. It acknowledged reality instead of arguing with it. Snow would fall, wind would push, cold would linger, so the structure accepted those forces and used them. That mindset is rare today. We are encouraged to optimize, to trim excess, to trust averages, but averages do not save you when conditions leave the chart. Preparedness is not fear, it is respect. The man who built that cabin did not survive because he was tougher than his neighbors. He survived because he listened to land a history to failures that had already happened elsewhere. When the worst winter arrived, his house did not prove him right. It simply did what it was built to do. That is the frontier standard, quiet performance under pressure. And it still applies. The structures and lives that last are not the ones built to look correct. They are the ones built to stay standing when everything else is tested. Winter always comes. The only question is whether you planned for it or hoped you wouldn't need to.